I'm here today with April Stace. April is an author, a professor, a pastor, and a harpist. She teaches at the General Theological Seminary of the Episcopal Church in New York City and serves as a minister at the First Presbyterian Church in Brooklyn, New York. She lives in the lower Hudson River Valley in New York State with her spouse, Lou, who is they or them, and her 13-year-old son, Luke. Her most recent book, White Knuckle Love, a Memoir of Holding, was released in November of 2020. And I want to read the blurb for that book just to give you a little bit more context about April. April Stace, a happily married 35-year-old mother, harpist, and ordained pastor, and aspiring tenure-track professor, thought she had finally made it when she accepted a dream job in New York City. Less than a year later, she found herself jobless, divorced, broke, and certain that she had failed in every way that mattered. In a last-ditch effort to support herself and her son, she began training as a chaplain at an urban hospital. As she encountered death day after day, she began to wonder, what would it mean to fall in love with being alive again? In this book, White Knuckle Love, we encounter a spirit who learned to let go of the person she thought she should be in order to embrace life in unexpected places. Hospital rooms, long subway commutes, a lesbian dance club, mundane moments of parenthood, and even in her own checkered past. Can we find our way to losing ourselves? So, April, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
So, obviously, just from that, we know that you've got a very, I wouldn't say whatever the opposite of boring is, past. Can you just kind of expand on a little bit on, the saga and the journey that's led you here?
Yeah, sure. It's funny, when I first started writing this book, I really didn't like the idea of writing a memoir. I was kind of still an academic and really wanted it to be an academic book and all that stuff, but I was coached very well into making it into a memoir. And one of my primary arguments was my life is not interesting enough to be a memoir. Like, I should not write a memoir. And then my coach, who's a really great guy from the Collegeville Institute, said, okay, like maybe your life is not interesting enough, but at least the past year has been interesting enough. And I thought, okay, fair enough. Like, we can go with that. So yeah, if I would have talked to you like 10 years ago, I would have said I'm the mother of a 3-year-old. I've been married to my husband for 12 or 13 years. And my goal, I was still in my PhD program. So my goal was to become a tenure-track professor somewhere teaching religion and culture. I had a very clear, a difficult path because, it's not that easy to find like tenure-track professorships in religion. But I thought, okay, like I'm getting my life together here. Things gonna be all right. But yeah, and then just a couple of years later, everything really fell apart. I moved to New York City for a job at the Riverside Church because I kind of finally gave up on the academic job market at a certain point. And but then within a year, really had lost everything that made me, like my marriage, my job, like where I lived. I was living in New York City. I didn't have any kind of community around me whatsoever. And really like my understanding of faith and God and what's right and wrong, and really everything evaporated. So it was pretty intense. It was not boring. And then hearing you read that from the back of the book, all I can think is like, oh my gosh, thank God I'm not there anymore. Like,
well, what a set of crises, identity crises, existential, changes. There's commonly, used phrase about reinventing yourself, but typically that's not used to the degree to which, you had to reinvent yourself.
Yeah. There's a sentence in the book where I say, I feel like a book where all of my pages have been torn out. And all that's left is this like collapsing old spine. I really felt like everything I knew about who I was and who I was going to be just had to be rewritten. Like the life that I thought I was going to look ahead to all of a sudden wasn't there anymore. And so, yeah, I wish I could say it was like, as kind of like reinventing makes it sound more like purposeful than it really is, because so much of it is just surviving and like just making things fit. But
Well,
yeah,
it's a forced reinvention, even if it's not a, intentional reinvention. It's still, driven by necessity, at least,
yeah, which is so different than like, I think I'm going to reinvent myself. I'm
Right.
middle-aged, right?
Absolutely.
It's really like, well, I have to do this, or like, I think I'm literally going to die. So like the choices are pretty stark.
Mm. Well, you've also published other books and lots of music. So can we talk about those two tracks for a
Yeah.
moment too, before we get further into the book? So first, maybe tell us about the other books that you wrote previous to this.
Sure. Yeah. So I wrote one and I edited one, and this was when I was trying to be an academic, like a full-time academic. So one of the first one was a collection I edited with another really talented, brilliant human um, named Mike Clausen. And this was a book of essays that we collected from different professors around a phenomenon of the late 90s and 2000s called the emerging church, a movement that we were both really heavily involved with. And then the other one is called Secular Music, Sacred Space. And it is a book based on my dissertation in which I did a bunch of field work looking at what I call in the book post-denominational evangelical churches who used secular music in their worship services on the regular. So, I mean, not like CCM music, but like Bon Jovi or like, I don't know, Katy Perry. I mean, there were lots of, and then even some older stuff too. So just looking at that and like what it meant to them and what it was, how we could look at it in the broader American culture. So that's my kind of academic publishing. In terms of harp, I've been playing harp for practically as long as I've been breathing. I majored in it in college, so that was another potential track of my life. Like at one point I thought I was going to be an orchestral harpist, but also went through a time with that, where I was like, it was kind of a revelation of, no, I don't want to do this. Like I love playing harp, but I don't love the classical music world. So I kind of tossed aside my giant classical harp, 8 feet, all 8 feet of it, and picked up the Celtic harp. And so I've been making recordings with my Celtic harp for, like 20 years now. And I did a Christmas album this year, which was my first album that I've done in the last 10 years. So
I was just going to ask you if you had anything new, on the music side. That's great.
Yeah, it was really fun. I went kind of like all kind of renegade with it in that I refused to put it on Spotify or Apple Music, where all my other music is. Like if you search me or my band Harp 46, you'll find it everywhere there. But I was kind of like, you know what? I am too old to be like making this music and then having it make money for a big corporation. Like I just have done my time. So I put it on Bandcamp, where you have to pay for it and then you own it, kind of old school. But did it for the joy.
Good. Well, I hope you do some more. I mean,
yeah, thank you.
With the talent that you've got in that area. I mean, I understand what you mean about the difference between performing music versus being in that in any industry. I mean, it's two completely different things.
Totally. I mean, the whole classical musician kind of milieu depends on this really, I want to say it's very white. You know what I mean? Like it's very kind of white supremacist almost, and it's oriented because it comes from Europe, right? I mean, it's but it's very like separate between the performer and the audience, and it's very academic, it's very like high-minded, and you have to be really rich in order to go see the concerts, and all of that was just so antithetical to who I wanted to be as a human, and definitely as a musician. Not throwing any shade on classical musicians because I love classical music too, but I just I want to sit on a stage and like tell stories while I play.
Cool. So with the book that you just came out with, White Knuckle Love, that comes from Resource Publications. So can you tell us a little bit about how that happened? In terms of connecting with them and making the book happen.
Yeah, sure. So I published the edited volume I did with Mike Clausen was with. Resource is a little subgenre in Whitford Stock, which is the bigger publisher. And so we had published with them our first volume. And I knew they were like pretty decent humans to work with. And yeah, I don't know. I sent it out to them thinking like, I know they're good folks, and they took it on.
So you didn't like look for an agent or like send out book proposals to, 50 different publishers or anything like that?
Oh, well, thanks for asking me. I forget about that part of the process a lot.
You want to forget about that process, right?
I know. I went through such a process with this book in regards to how I wanted to put it out in the world, because I really felt like, even though it has spirituality, as one of its themes, I wouldn't really call it like a Christian book, or like so I really, for a long time, I wanted a more, like probably a more secular publisher to take it on. And so I did look for an agent for a very long time. I sent out, I don't even know how many queries to agents. But I didn't have enough platform to be taken seriously by anyone. So then I decided to kind of go to the smaller publishers in the Christian market. And that was a little bit of a decision-making process, like whether I wanted to go with a denominational press or, something else. But, like I said, I think by that point in the process, this is one of my big flaws. I'm just like, the book is written. I don't care how it gets out. Just please leave my house right now and go on.
It's amazing, how the book industry has changed to be so dominated by platform.
Yeah. I'm learning.
I mean, I'm relatively new to this myself. I've only been involved in this space for a few years, but that's just become, so evident that, 15, 20 years ago wasn't like this at all.
Yeah.
And now that just completely dominates the decision-making process, the actual rollout process, everything.
Yeah. And, you and I have talked a little bit about independent publishing. And It's really made me think a lot about the parallels between the music world and the book publishing world, in that, I've recorded, I think, 5 or 6 CDs with my band, Harp 46, which is harp, bass, and drums. And we started in the very early 2000s, before the music industry, I think, really took the huge shift it took towards online and stuff like that. But it didn't even occur to us to think about trying to find a label. I mean, it was a no-brainer that, like, of course, no, like, it wouldn't be a financially good decision. It would mean we didn't have creative control. All that, it didn't even cross our minds. And it's, talking with you has really made me think, oh, so now, like, applying that kind of thinking to the book publishing industry, I don't know, it could be really interesting.
Yeah, they're not completely apples to apples. There's an awful lot of parallels, but, there are different pros and cons, different, dynamics that are going on within those two different industries. And certainly the timing has been much different too.
Yeah.
So, it's clear what direction it's going.
Mm-hmm.
There's no question about that. But the extent to which, and, the economics, how that ends up playing out is, not at all clear.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's going to be a hybrid situation for a long, long time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, by the early 2000s, the independent musicians, seeing that somebody didn't have a record label meant absolutely nothing in terms of what kind of quality you were going to get when you played the CD.
Wow.
Right? It meant nothing. And I'm thinking eventually we're going to get there with books too. Right?
We'll see.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got a lot of respect for the traditional publishing houses that I work with, the people at the traditional publishing houses that I work with, because they really know their stuff, both, from an acquisitions perspective, making selections, as well as the actual editing of the books themselves. Now, marketing, that's a whole other thing. I wouldn't say that's their strong point. But, the selection and the making great books, they're really good at that. But anyway, which is again a different dynamic than music, but some similarities too.
Yeah.
So what, for the book that, we're talking about here, White Knuckle Love, what do you really want people to get out of it?
So this was one of the things I struggled with when I wrote it in terms of should I write it? Because, when you're writing a book as an academic, it's really, you have to have a really clear objective, right? In fact, you write out the entire outline of the book before you write it. And then you write out like sub outlines. And then it's so planned out, and you have to have like a central argument. And so that really plagued me for this book, because I really was like, what is my central argument? I was still applying the academic mindset to the memoir. And then also really thinking like, well, who, kind of my own self devaluing. I'm just like, well, who cares? Like, this is just a bunch of stories. Like, it's just a bunch of, yeah, I had a couple really freaking hard years, but I'm still a person of like relative privilege. What am I going to do with that? But what I think I've seen now and believe even more now that the book is out is that, when I was in the hospital, when I was a chaplain, I really got to understand how sharing our stories with one another is absolutely transformative. I learned from my patients. I talked to so many patients from so many different backgrounds, just all over the place. And getting to really sit with them, right? Like in really a moment of crisis where you can people are so transparent in so many ways in that time. And I was healed by their stories, I think, and inspired and challenged and just really brought into more of myself through sitting with them. And so I think that is what I want this book to kind of offer the world is first of all, I want the stories of my patients, who are amazing and completely anonymized, by the way, in the book, to be held. I want people to know the gloriousness of these human beings, because they are glorious. But then also, I spend a lot of my time being like the competent one in the room. I'm a professor, I'm a pastor. Like, I'm usually like one of the people that, kind of knows what's sort of going on and like people kind of look to for leadership. And this is a book about me just being completely incompetent. And I really feel like that is an important story. Like, I don't know, can't we find our connection with each other in our incompetence at life? I mean, that's a connecting string, right? We are all totally incompetent at this thing.
Yeah. I mean, for any of us to think that we've got our act together, quote unquote, is, yeah, right. I mean, just
like
wait. Yeah. Yeah. Well, what about looking forward? Do you see any more books or you want to channel your energies in different directions?
I'm doing a couple things. I'm doing some regular writing circles. I lead these online writing circles for people, not for people to like become the best writer in the world, but really just using writing as a tool to uncover the parts of your spirit that have been left behind. Big believer in the power of writing for that. So I'm leading those. I'm doing some coaching, which has been really, really fun. But in terms of writing, I'm actually starting a book with my spouse, Lou, who is genderqueer and a psychologist. And we're going to write a book about gender and transness and spirituality and the church. So that's what's up next on my docket.
Cool. Well, I know writing circles or writing groups, have been very valuable for a lot of folks that I talk to, work with. Yeah. So, glad to hear that you're doing that. And, the mutual support that those provide seems to be really important.
Yes, I totally agree. I was in a writing circle myself when I just had a baby, so 13 years ago. And it was like the only space I had for me in my entire life, and the only space where I could go deeper into myself and just like the next feeding or the next diaper change or whatever it was. So I think those spaces are sacred and holy, and I love getting to offer them to people.
Well, April, I really appreciate you spending some time with us and share your journey, share your book. Again, people can order it now online, or if you can get to your favorite bookstore, I'm sure they can get it as well. It's called White Knuckle Love. So April, thanks a lot for joining us and sharing everything with us.
Thanks so much, Brian.